Hello folks, it's Kim Lowe here. I'm the director of Arthur Rylah Institute. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're continuing our series of ARI legacy seminars, which is celebrating 50 years of Arthur Rylah Institute. And it's really great to have you join us again today. The first seminar I gave about a month ago, we had fabulous response, so thank you. And today we've got Matt White, who's going to present, and Matt's had over 30 years experience working as a field botanist and a plant ecologist, and he's done this with various government and non-government agencies in New South Wales, Victoria and the Northern Territory. He's been working at ARI for around the past 20 years, and of course Matt's research interests are in ecological modelling, community and ecosystem description, environmental history, which will be a big feature of today, development of spatially explicit models of biodiversity attributes. And this includes the habitat distribution models, the strategic management prospects are just a couple of examples. So Matt's work is very well known, and it is highly regarded both nationally and internationally. Matt's a key member of ARI's spatial analysis team, and through that team, he continues to make a major contribution, providing an impressive evidence base for government decision making. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Matt today and to have Matt present this talk as part of our legacy series. Can I ask you, if you've got any questions, please use the chat function and we'll scan them during the seminar and we'll come back to them at the end of the seminar. So there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. So Matt, welcome. I'd like to invite you to present your talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kim, for those kind words. Yeah, today I'm going to just recap. It's kind of a personal journey. It's a personal view of what's happened over the last 50 years in Victoria. It's kind of like a very short review of how nature conservation has progressed since the late 1960s, which coincides not coincidentally with the beginnings of the Arthur Rylah Institute. So I should mention that this really only covers part of the story. It's just the story that I've been following and kind of interested in, largely around land cover change, and the loss of native vegetation is pretty much part of the focus of this. Before I start, I'm going to make an acknowledgement, and this journey needs this acknowledgement to the First Nations people of Victoria. I'm going to be mentioning lots of words like management and land ownership and Crown land and reserved land, and in the context of having never ceded the land to invaders. You know, these words sort of sub-offensive to you, so I do apologise. And let's hope that some of that can be redressed into the future. But I would like to pay my respects to all of the elders of Victoria, the concept that we understand to be Victoria, all of the nations that intersect with that idea that is Victoria. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, future, and emerging. So just briefly, the story, I mean, in this story, I mean to use the term nature conservation probably in a very narrow sense, in the sense of protecting ecosystems and habitats. The conservation of nature in this sense is for its intrinsic worth rather than conservation of natural resources. There's lots of conservation that goes on maintaining and managing natural resources, but this is more or less just for their intrinsic value. So I'm not really considering here the invasion of exotic species, the impacts, direct and indirect, of pollution, the all-pervasive impacts of climate change, and the more insidious and less detectable changes that are associated with decline in function and condition of ecosystems. So I guess what I want to talk about, well, what I'm going to be summarising under different policy settings over the last 50 years is specifically thinking about the protection of native forests from timber harvesting. And in that instance, the sort of native forests that timber interests seek to use, the protection of ecosystems from clearing for agriculture, and the protection of land from domestic stock grazing. But first, just we need to sort of set the scene. So we need to go back before our study period. I often talk to this point that the arrangement of land uses and land cover in a place like Victoria is not random. We're in a post-frontier sort of society and state where the terrain, the rainfall and the soils predict a land use pattern. If we look at the original vegetation types that Victoria supported prior to European invasion, it probably looked something like this map, with the blue and yellow areas of woodlands and grasslands. So they're ready made for grazing and cultivation. And if we look at the sort of proportions of the state that's kind of the makeup, 35.5% of Victoria was eucalypt forest, and a substantial amount of that area remains. So this is the remnant vegetation circa to 2010, and as you can see, substantial. It's a non-random pattern, and the substantial areas of forest remain, whereas huge amounts of grassland, woodland, and mallee have been removed. And that's also reflected in the distribution of public land. The history of Victoria has been one where when a technology comes along that enables land to be developed for intensive agriculture, that tends to happen pretty quickly. So, by the early 1900s, we basically had removed about 30% of the vegetation, and a substantial amount of the vegetation that wasn't removed was actually being used for grazing purposes. By the 1940s, we only had about 62% of the state was still predominantly native. And by 2010, there's only about 41% remaining. Like I was saying, where this remnant vegetation is in the landscape is fairly predictable, but there are exceptions, and that's where we're going to sort of start with the first of those exceptions, which happened in 1969. So this is our time. This is our first era that we're going to explore, which goes from 1969, I should say, to 1972. But this is the era of where the Premier was Henry Bolte, and he'd been the Premier since 1955. And he kind of represents an era where natural resources were to be conserved but used by the community. And in accordance with that, lots of agencies were kind of captured by their industries. So the Rural Water Commission was deigned to service the irrigation industry, so they would build a dam and sell the water and oversupply the sales, or basically run out of water, and then they build another impoundment, and then the irrigation industry would expand. Likewise, the Forest Commission was another professional body that was set up by government to both regulate the use of timber, but also to promote its use and to promote the timber industry. The Crown Lands and Survey Department, one of their key roles was to evaluate land such that it could be alienated from the Crown, and that those resources could be used privately. At the time, at the start of our era here, in 1969, technologies had been developed by agronomists that allowed the deep sands of the Little Desert and the southern part of the Big Desert to be cleared and productively used for grazing cattle, and in some instances even for cereal cropping. That process was incomplete, and there was a grassroots community movement that basically stopped that process. So that was possibly one of the first times in Victoria's history, outside of reserving places for timber resources, where Crown land was actually reserved or protected from clearing for its own intrinsic worth. And this grassroots movement gave rise in the end to the Conservation Council of Victoria. And along with the VNPA, the Victorian National Parks Association, the CCV, which eventually became Environment Victoria, basically started out NGO conservation campaigning in Victoria. The context of the sort of late 60s was there were some serious bushfires and there were droughts. The backdrop was a growing awareness that the environment had values, and there was a growing awareness in the community of the recreational and intrinsic value of wild places. In response to the controversy around clearing the Little Desert, an agency that was independent of government, well, independent to some degree, they were government, but they were an independent body. The Land Conservation Council was established in 1970, and their task was to go around regions of the state, have a look at the demands placed on Crown land from the various interest groups, and they would make independent recommendation to Parliament on the future use of Crown land. In 1971, the National Parks Service was established. Prior to that, they were an authority. The National Parks estate at this point in history was minuscule. It really just was a very small set of parks, and in fact, the Little Desert, the addition of part of the Little Desert to the National Parks estate was added over a quarter of area to the parks estate. I mean, it really basically was Mount Buffalo, Wilson's Promontory, and a few handkerchief-sized little bits and pieces scattered around the state. In 1972, the Victorian Conservation Trust was established, and that's now what we know to be the Trust for Nature. And it really kicked off conservation on private land. Finally, I would mention that ecology as a discipline and a science was emergent at this point. That groups of people at La Trobe University, Monash University, Melbourne University were starting to explore environmental issues, explore applied approaches to applied ecology, basically. And also government agencies are starting to explore, and a key group would have been the Botanic Gardens under Paul Gullen. We're starting to explore ecosystem classification. Also, the Soil Conservation Authority with their land systems was pivotal in that sense. In the late 70s, just underneath that sort of timeline, I've got a number of points around the loss of habitat. So between 1968 and 1970, about 75,000 hectares were lost to were lost and alienated largely for cropping, but there were substantial areas that were just cleared for grazing. About 1,700 hectares were lost to new reservoirs, so native vegetation went underwater. A key, of interest there is Lake Macomb, which was flooded in 1971, and was dismantled in 2002. Between 1969 and 1973, there was about 50,000 hectares of bushland, so native vegetation, that was cleared deliberately to establish pines. So this was this process of clearing native vegetation for pine plantations had been going on since the 1940s at quite an accelerated rate. And sorry, in 1970, ARI was opened by the next era we're going to look at is the 1970s, basically under Dick Hamer or Rupert Hamer. I've got Rupert Hamer up in the top left corner there on his little pedestal, but in the centre bottom is his deputy, Lindsay Thompson, who took over as Premier towards the end of this era, so he's included there as a sort of adjunct. Just a little bit of context, climate context. 1974 to 76, there were record wet years across much of Australia, but Victoria was no exception. We had incredible rainfall, lots of flooding events, lots of complete lack of concern about water resources, and in fact probably the quantity of rain and the amount of recharge in the environment generally led to concerns with dryland salinity, and also wet dryland salinity across the state, but also in irrigation areas, because there was so much water available for irrigation that it was producing saline groundwater. In 1974, this sort of seminal document was produced by the BNPA called Alps at the Crossroads, and it had an enormous amount of influence on a burgeoning and emerging community and consciousness of environmental issues. It was a real catalyst for change, and it started the push for an alpine national park. So the parks estate was starting to grow over this period. Croaging Along National Park was declared. The Alpine National Park, parts of what we currently conceive of as the Alpine National Park, had been declared as well. But one of the new concepts that entered the lexicon was the idea of once-over logging. So lots of parks like the Otway National Park and the Alpine National Park, some logging was allowed within the boundaries of the park, which was a new idea and offensive to some. Another thing that was introduced during the Hamer era was the use of town planning instruments to achieve conservation outcomes, which was a relatively new thing for Victoria. So a whole lot of green wedges, which are still with us today, were basically planned or put into the planning scheme to protect open areas and open space in Melbourne. The other thing that was going on nationally was people, individuals, communities, concerned citizens were starting to actually demand more access to the decision-making process, and decisions that had already been made that people were frustrated with, they sought to intervene directly. So there were sit-ins in Terania Creek and of course paddle-ins on the Franklin River, which promoted in most cases a response from governments in terms of enforcement. Just as a sort of backdrop to the 1970s, a period of probably, while there's an emerging interest in the environment, there's still the legacy of past commitments to supply timber and past commitments to property rights. So between 1972 and 82, some 129,000 hectares of Crown land were alienated. Somewhere in the order of 280,000 hectares, so 28,000 hectares is the rate per year of woody vegetation was cleared. Again, with the flooding of Dartmouth, a substantial area of native vegetation was lost to dam construction. Dartmouth was built in 1979, or was finally flooded in 1979. In 1972 to 1982, still clearing for pine plantations is going on, and roughly 33,400 hectares was lost directly to clearing for pine plantation. This was in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s was a key issue for the conservation movement, was to stop clearing for pine plantations. Over this period, approximately 22,000 hectares per annum was taken for timber harvesting, or timber was harvested across 22,000 hectares per annum. Now that's a reasonably small area, but a huge amount of the focus is on productive forests. In 1982, there was still 2.3 million hectares of Victoria leased for grazing. So there were very, very large areas of the state where seasonally or opportunistically those public lands were available for people to lease for grazing their stock. The third period we're going to sort of explore here is the Cain-Kirner era. So we're now talking about the 80s and to the early 90s. And this was a period of huge change in the way that public land was administered. In just the background to the start of this period is that in 1982 there was a very, very severe and deep drought, very short and dramatic drought, which the outworkings of which was the Ash Wednesday bushfires, which killed over 70 people. Lots of things were initiated in the 1980s. So the community organisations such as Landcare and Victorian Invention, Greening Australia, Land for Wildlife, again, Land for Wildlife emerged from Fisheries and Wildlife Department, which was based at ARI. The Parks estate grew over a huge amount over this period of time. So the Alpine National Park was finally completed as a contiguous area. Very, very large parks in the Mallee were established. The Grampians was finally turned into a national park. And then, not unlike the Little Desert, Errinundra National Park was a bit of a watershed moment for parks and reserves, because up until this period, the only very, very high value forests that were reserved permanently, high value forests for timber, that is, that were reserved permanently, had once over logging arrangements. In the instance of Errinundra Plateau, a large swathe of old growth, high value, highly productive forest was reserved in the national park. So a precedent was set. There was lots of changes to government administrative processes. So previously, the separate agencies of the Soil Conservation Authority, Fisheries and Wildlife Department, the National Parks Service, the Forest Commission, Crown Lands and Survey, all of these agencies were jammed into the one agency. And some of these agencies had been around for, nearly 100 years. Forest Commission from 1908 and Soil Con from 1940. So there was a whole lot of agencies that were jammed together to form the Conservation, Forest and Lands Department. There are also many new ideas emerged from this period. There was Victoria's first conservation strategy. There were wetland policies that operated through, well, the intention was that they operate through the planning scheme. The Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act was passed, as well as a new Planning and Environment Act, under which controls over the clearing of native vegetation were established under the Planning and Environment Act. The timber industry strategy was finalised, and a code of practice was established and probably protected more in that one, so the formalising the protection and buffering of streams, rainforest, and steep prohibiting forestry activities on steep slopes, probably contributed more to the direct conservation of nature than any other decision in this whole period. Victorians began to actually go into the forest and chain themselves to trees and lock their arms into bulldozers. People were directly campaigning against forest logging. Also, cattle in the high country was an ongoing issue, and many studies were initiated to explore the impacts of cattle grazing on the vegetation of the largely the treeless country in the high country in the Alps. All this time, so throughout the 70s and 80s, the scientists at ARI and others were starting to build an inventory of ecosystems, a language around the diversity of ecosystems, and building a lexicon of things that we should care about and understand better. And for me, a key light bulb moment when I was a lot younger was staring at the maps that people at ARI and probably ultimately they started out at Kew but ended up at ARI. People were drawing maps of the vegetation types in the Mallee, and prior to that work that was undertaken for the LCC and in their regional review of the Mallee area, prior to that the Mallee was just the Mallee. Everything was just more scrub, more noxious scrub. But after that exercise of mapping those ecosystems, people could see that there was lots of nuance, lots of difference, lots of potential interest, and lots of rare and unusual things that were in the Mallee. And this was also done in concert with bird surveys and insect surveys and mammal surveys. So an integrated inventory of ecosystems and the assemblages of animals and plants associated with them was underway. And I think it really started to get cranking in the late 80s and early 90s. Still, there were still things going on in the landscape. So while alienation for agriculture basically ceased, there's still a lot of land clearing going on, and a lot of that was undertaken in the lead up to the native vegetation controls. Approximately 235,000 hectares of woody vegetation was cleared during this period. There were some small reservoirs, well, not small, but Thompson Reservoir was not small. But yes, about 2,500 hectares were directly lost due to the construction of reservoirs. But clearing for pine plantations had been abandoned, and basically pines and hardwood plantations from the early 80s was basically put onto purchased private freehold. In 1982, in this period 82 to 92, around about 25,000 hectares of forest was harvested per annum, which is still a substantial amount. But well over 1 million hectares of grazing leases were phased out in the Mallee, but there was still grazing in riverine public lands and in the Alps. So on to the Kennett era. So this is most of the 90s, and Kennett's famous for privatising, just basically changing up the way how deeply government is involved in running things directly. So the privatisation was one part of that. Another part was this establishment of boards and ancillary agencies that were tasked with running things. So in 1993, the Plantations Corporation was created, and that was really a precursor to the sale of the plantations to private interests. But one of the issues was that quite a lot of native forest was handed over in the same process in the Strzelecki years. So that caused a lot of confusion and difficulty in the ensuing couple of decades. In 1994, the catchment management boards were established across Victoria. So to coordinate in an integrated way, but at a regional, with regional administration, how public and private interests should coordinate their efforts for better catchment management. In 1996, in the latter part of the 20th century, the millennium drought begins. But there's still a lag time between the start of the drought and conservation concerns. So salinity, particularly on private land, was still a huge issue for land care groups and for funding agencies like the National Heritage Trust, NHT. In 1996, Kennett established Parks Victoria. So again, sort of corporatised the parks arm, the park management arm of DELP. Oh, sorry, what was called DELP, but I think it's DEPI at the time. The other thing that was going on was, for the first time, the primary industries got a slightly different, merger with, so the resource use and the resource conservation interests were melded in possibly the first kind of mega department that had responsibility for land management. In 1997, the East Gippsland Regional Forest Agreement was signed, and the lead up to the East Gippsland Regional Forest Agreement was a whole range of rules around the forest ecosystems and targets for their reservation, how they're defined, and what proportions of each would be required in the reserve system in accordance with their degree of depletion. So this gave rise to ecological vegetation class mapping, ecosystem mapping generally across the forested areas of the continent, but also thinking about where these ecosystems extended prior to European invasion, so we could calculate depletion rates. And Victoria and ARI was at the forefront of that process. Land clearing, clearing woody vegetation had declined to a very, very low levels by this point, even in the Kennett era. And like I said, salinity was a huge focus for government attention and spending. Towards the end of the decade, Victoria's produced its first biodiversity strategy, in which the term no net loss was coined for the first time. And many people who worked at ARI were involved in producing that strategy. So during this period, there was still quite a lot of timber harvesting going on, about 19,000 hectares per annum. So the first decade of the 21st century, probably the three things that strike me as being important in this period are drought, fire, and water. In 2002, there was a very large fire in Mallee, and this began, a decade of very large mega fires, basically. 2003 Divide Fire, the 2005 Prom Fire, a big fire in the Grampians in 2006, 2006 Alpine Fire. There was a huge fire in the Brisbane Ranges, closer to Melbourne, and then of course in 2009 Black Star Day. In 2002 was notable too because private nature conservation made a huge step in Victoria, following trends nationally, but Trust for Nature bought Victoria's largest freehold parcel in Ned's Corner and started the process of rehabilitating that part of very fascinating part of Victoria. The Otway Park was declared after lots of local campaigning from the community and the tourist industry as well. In 2005, cattle were, or at least temporarily, removed from all of the high country leases, although that was a bit on again, off again, with lots of toing and froing between state and federal agencies. Border entitlements. I should have mentioned this earlier that right back in the 80s that environmental flows were being talked about and mentioned as demands from impoundments, where lots of conflicts and shortages of water. This came to a head in this period of time with the record low inflows into the Murray-Darling system. In 2007, Vic Forests, Vic Forest, the agency that is charged with harvesting and selling timber across Victoria, was established. And of course, to close out the decade, we had Black Saturday. Land clearing, like I say, still, with respect to woody vegetation, still very, very low levels. A lot of it increasingly being associated with urban development rather than anything else. I would add that I haven't included the loss of grassy vegetation and wetland vegetation because it was a little bit difficult to compare with earlier eras, but this is starting to really take off during the millennial drought, where the cropping industry is expanding massively and lots of primary and secondary grasslands are being lost to cropping. I mean, we're talking about many tens of thousands of hectares. Yes, increased focus on water, carbon and carbon sequestration and greenhouse climate change issues generally. Commitment of government to no net loss is maintained, and that gives rise to the vegetation framework, which had a whole lot of one of Victoria's first formalised offsetting arrangements, which also gave rise to a whole lot of what we might think of as market-based instruments to undertake to achieve conservation outcomes, including reverse options, again, which people from ARI were involved in. In 1999, over this period, the native forest harvesting is dwindled to about 11,000 hectares per annum, and this is really, at least in part, around to some degree the closing of areas of the state that have been over harvested, but there's also the various points over the last 20 years the discontinuity between reservation exclusions, the Code of Forest Practices exclusions, hadn't quite been conducted in sync with sustained yield and timber license, or timber sales. So at different times, various areas had to make up the shortfall, and that resulted in places being over harvested. And at this point in time, in the mid-2000s, the Wombat Forest was effectively, and now it turns out to be permanently set aside from native forest harvesting. Okay, the final era we're going to look at is the last 10 years. Climate change has become a massive issue, and the decade started out with the Victorian government producing a Climate Change Act to demonstrate or to facilitate processes towards redressing Victoria's making a contribution from the state to climate mitigation. In 2010, the millennial drought ended, finally, although it may be a new normal in terms of rainfall. We still have very low rainfall on average since the millennial drought. There was a Royal Commission into fuel reduction burning, which meant massive changes to the amount of fuel reduction. The Royal Commission into the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires set area targets for fuel reduction burning, which result in very large areas of the state being burnt frequently. In 2014, cattle were definitively removed from the high country, which was something that the conservation movement had been working towards from the very early part of the whole period we're looking at. And finally, in 2019, the whole forest debate has culminated in the native forest harvesting is to be phased out over the next 10 years. Land clearing, again, the woody component of it has declined to very, very low levels. In fact, arguably, if you look at Cain, native forests are on the increase, with plantations being retired and large replanting schemes going on and restoration schemes going on. The most exciting thing that's happening in land management in Victoria for a long time, well, potentially over the last 200 years, is that land, sea and water rights are returning to, or some rights are returning to the traditional owners. Traditional owners and the community, I think probably it's fair to say, have got an increasing role in land management generally. And just getting onto the native forest, getting back to native forests is further, the area that's harvested per annum is diminished even more, and that reflects the dwindling supply of timber. And this is not just because of selling volumes in excess of supply based on sustained yield. This is really taking into account the very, very large losses of timber that were sustained during the Alpine fires and particularly Black Saturday. And that's where I'll leave it. I like this photo of this is Henry Bolte, and I think it just sort of illustrates how things have changed over the period. Henry was a enthusiastic sports shooter and was a campaign for wetland conservation as well. But I doubt that a modern politician would be interested in being photographed with a cocked shotgun. Well, no, he's about to load his shotgun, and he's got a fishing rod in the background there as well. So it's all, and there's actually, I think I can see an EK Holden right out, way out the back. Anyway, I'll leave it open for questions.
Great, thanks, Matt. Kim here again. Fantastic talk. Matt, we've got questions and I'll ask them on the basis of the most popular. So there's one here that says, is it clear how much the landscape has changed on private land over the last few decades?
Sorry, Matt, I muted you because you were getting a bit of feedback.
Yep.
You might just have to unmute yourself again.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
That's a good question. I think probably in my professional life, that's been one of the great dilemmas, is that we there's 2/3 of the state that we don't know very much about, and because we don't monitor it, and we only really allowed onto private land, at the behest of the owner. So in terms of, there is an enormous amount of biodiversity and nature out on private land, in particular, I think the wetter end of the spectrum, so wetlands. But the extent to which private land, I mean, I'm only just sort of exploring this at the moment, the extent to which wetlands have been drained. I mean, it's very, very hard to find a wetland of any description that hasn't got a series of drainage channels feeding through them and beyond them. There's been an enormous amount of effort over the decades draining wetlands. Lots of places, of course, around Shepherd and elsewhere have been laser leveled. So, and everywhere has been subjected to superphosphate and gypsum and other kind of environmental pollutants. So it's the degree to which we haven't really come to grips with how much these things have impacted on the indigenous biodiversity as yet. So that
Matt, perhaps so. Yeah, I think so. Thank you. That's great. There's, I think, a related question, which is like a segue. The question is, if alienation for agriculture has largely ceased, what happened to the 235,000 hectares? I think that means that has been cleared. What's happened to that land?
Oh, so I think I get the anomaly there. This is private land that was uncleared, that was cleared. So it had been alienated previously and just people hadn't got around to clearing it. There still is quite a substantial area of the state that's in that condition.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how does this trend with patterns compare with other states, such as New South Wales?
Okay, so Victoria, the southeastern part of South Australia and Victoria and the wheat belt of Western Australia are kind of analogous. But there's a whole lot of New South Wales, it's partly because of the very close settlement of Victoria, that there's always, and the high population density in Victoria, there's always been a sort of more demand to be a young farmer than there was supply. So in New South Wales, you don't see the same patterns, particularly west of the Divide, where there are substantial areas of land that could be cropped that haven't been cropped. Although there's still lots of conversions of bimblebox and mallee into cropping land that's just continuing to go on in New South Wales. And also in Queensland. So there's been Victoria's a bit of a one-off in the sense that apart from there's very, very little unsatiated or very little sort of unrequited demand in effect.
Thank you. So, Matt, there's a question from Fern, which is she's thanking you for the tour through the decades, and she was interested to hear your comments on the role of changing technology in ARI's work and contribution to these issues.
Yeah, good question. I was actually going to cover this in the talk, but decided to leave it out. You could write in 1972, Landsat, the first Landsat Earth observing satellite was launched, and was sending data back to Earth. And I've actually been looking at these data at the moment and trying to do composites so that we can explore the trends in land use history and the trends at particular locations in terms of their disturbance history. So I think satellite imagery is one area that has massively changed our outlook from the 70s through to now, and we're just getting more and more finely resolved data temporally and spatially. I think the sort of sensing devices has been a massive change. So sort of rather than remote sensing, there's lots of close sensing going on. So people putting devices into the environment to listen and record, and I think that's a massive advance. Genetics, of course, and genomics, they're huge changes, and that they're really accelerating now as it becomes, people are much more capable of analysing the data and collecting the data, DNA, etc. What else? Just I think the whole discipline of applied ecology has grown in leaps and bounds, and it's partly about handling very large data sets, merging data sets, doing meta-analyses, collaborations, new thing. Really, 40 years ago, people didn't collaborate to the degree they do now. So the technology of the internet contributes greatly to those sorts of things. I think it's probably, drones is one of the, and apologies to people who use drones, but I think I've yet to see that really take over much. I don't know that it's realised its full potential as yet. Maybe that's a diplomatic thing to say.
So Matt, I might leave it at that point. I'm just looking at the time. We've got lots of questions. Thank you for an absolutely fabulous talk. It's been great to see the synthesis of your views on the key events that have happened over the period. I'm sure there'll be lots of people following up with you about a whole lot of questions. So thanks very much, Matt. Much appreciated. And today, Andy's put a Q&A note in that we're always seeking feedback from people that listen and watch these seminars. We really value that feedback. So before you leave, could you have a look in the Q&A box around the feedback form that we've got? There's a hyperlink there. And my last pleasure to do today is to flag the next seminar, which is coming up on Monday, the 17th of August. This one will be a little bit different to the looking back ones that we've had so far. This one will be looking forward, and we're talking about our future legacy. And we've invited a range of people from the Institute, including people like Lauren Johnson, Anik Harris, Tracy, Reagan, Josephine McHunter. I can't remember them all, I'm sorry, but please keep in touch, keep a lookout for our next seminar that's going to be on Monday, the 17th of August, between 1 and 2. I hope you can join us then. And as I said before in the feedback, we'll send you a link when the recording of today's session is available. Thanks for your participation. Thanks for your interest. All the very best. Bye-bye.